Hello and welcome to another episode of the Proceed podcast, the podcast where we talk SAP data management. I'm your host, Rebecca, and today we're talking compliance. I'm joined by Mark Johnson and Chris Burfitt from Proceed. We're going to be talking through some of the tools and technologies available to you for compliance and also some of the considerations with regards to running a compliance project. Okay, let's get started. Okay, can I just get you both to just quickly introduce yourselves?
Yeah, so I'm Chris Burfitt. I'm the HCM or Human Capital Management, Human Resources subject matter expert at Proceed. Related to that, because of the type of data that it is, I'm also one of the experts in the data protection side of things, GDPR in the EU and UK GDPR, but also data protection for other countries.
Okay, I'm Mark Johnson. I'm one of the lead consultants for Proceed Group for delivering ILM projects for GDPR and for finding the solutions for customers needing to be GDPR compliant.
Okay, perfect. Right, so question one, for businesses just starting to look at their data compliance, what's the first step they should take?
Well, the starting point is you really need to understand what the inventory is of GDPR relevant data within your SAP landscape. So you need to start analyzing where within your business processes you will find that data. So you need to have a look around in your HR environment, in your sales and marketing environment, and also in your distribution and logistics environment as well, depending on what your business does. It's also worth noting that you're not just looking inside your ECC or S4 system, you need to look inside your SRM, CRM solutions as well. And don't forget about BW, because BW will probably have some GDPR relevant information in there as well.
Yeah, and from a compliance point of view, let's not forget that it's not just data protection we're talking about here, but it's also a compliance in terms of you might need to keep the data for a particular amount of time. So you need to identify the stakeholders for the data. Who is it that's interested in this data? There are people who are typing it in day by day. People are using it in their transactions, in reports, in interfaces, and then you'll have a legal or data governance or policy type people who have rules that they want you to obey in terms of either keeping it for a particular period of time, which can be a very long time, or that they need you to get rid of the data, as in, usually in a GDPR or data protection compliance context, you are obliged to remove that data. So we need to make sure that you've spoken to all the right people with regards to those different angles.
Mm-hmm. So for those people that are just starting out on their journey, what are some of the challenges they might come across? What are sort of things they need to look out for?
I think one of the things that you need to look out for in this is that just how far widespread GDPR relevant data can be consumed inside your SAP landscape. You need to look across your HR environment, but equally that data can be propagated. So for example, you have an employee. The employee sets up and you're paying employees' expenses. So all of a sudden, the employee also has records created for it in the more commercial side of the SAP system. So they're actually set up as vendors so that their expenses are paid. You'll also find in some large organizations that there's an employee portal which is running off a CRM system, and when you generate an employee, it automatically generates data in the CRM system for that employee. So data can be propagated and spreads out like ripples on a pond in some respects from actually the central point of creation inside the ECC system. This also applies for customer data. So you have a customer that you've sold items to. Quite often, you've got some kind of CRM system which is being used to manage that customer, and you contact with the customer and manage whatever it is they've purchased. That could have portal technology sitting on top of it. So you need to look at where this data gets propagated out from the point where you generate a customer inside your system, etc. So there's quite an interesting effect of generating customer data, HR data for employees, etc., and even vendor data inside the system, where some of it will be GDPR compliant. You need to look at how that gets cascaded across different systems.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of that cascade, what is often overlooked is that that data has also been copied into some sort of test system or training system or development system. So customers, quite often, you'll find that they're being very tight on control in a production environment, but then in terms of compliance with data protection are actually failing in their development or test system because they've copied the production environment over. They don't have the same sort of access control there. They don't maybe have the firefighter access, that GRC, you can only have access to it for a certain amount of time. They just give, wide-ranging access to, internal or external consultants sometimes who are working on the systems. And in terms of that data protection, it clearly says that you can only have data if you see that data. You've got a purpose behind seeing that data, and having data in a test system, it is a relevant purpose, but it should not be uncontrolled, and that's sometimes a failure.
And there are also industry-specific considerations as well.
Yes, so with industry-specific considerations, how data is handled from one business type to another can change. So it's probably best to illustrate this with an example. So if you're working in a regulated industry, and that could be something like the pharmaceuticals industry, it could be the nuclear industry, the aerospace industry, etc., where, let's say, you need to keep the training records for somebody, not for the life just of the person, but it could be life of the product. So, if you're assembling the wings on an Airbus A380 and an Airbus A380 goes down because the wings have dropped off, you need to sort of go back down through the manufacturing records to see who assembled the wings and did they attend the correct training courses, were they up to date, etc. And of course, that data needs to be in the system. And some of these aircrafts will be in service for 50 years or longer. Similarly, with the nuclear industry, if you've got the training records and how you've trained somebody to handle a hazardous material, and then 5 years or 10 years or 20 years down the line, somebody comes back to the organization and starts the legal proceedings against the organization because they're claiming they weren't trained properly, and now they've got cancer by having exposure to that particular hazardous material. Again, you need to be able to prove that. So there's a lot of nuances in the regulations where you take the standard GDPR regulations and then you say, well, okay, if there is a legal requirement outside of GDPR to keep data for longer, or precedent or a reason, significant business reason for it, then you can keep that particular data for as long as necessary. Of course, it also says you need to make it as difficult as possible for it to be casually looked at, etc.
Yeah, and we were discussing earlier, obviously, about the government requirements for around pensions, which means that employee records need to be kept until the employee, even if they've left, until they're claiming a pension, but until that person is 100 years old, the data needs to be retained in the system. So that's going to be there for a very, very long time. But as Mark has mentioned, you need to make it so that only people who need to access that data can see the data. So even though it's still in the system, you need to make that make it safe. And the longer data is in the system and the more data you have in the system, the more at risk you are in a data breach situation. So, if you lose your employee records from your system and you've got 100, you're keeping data until people are age 100, you're going to have a lot of records in there for people who are no longer working for the organization. Your risks during that data breach are much higher.
Okay. Do we want to talk about the business complete point?
So one of the, how can I put it, Achilles heel that we have in any project that we do for, well, even for data archiving, but especially for GDPR compliance. And here's the issue. When you're blocking data inside an SAP system, it's using very similar algorithms to that which you use for data archiving. So it's using that to see, how the data is, etc., what data is there. For it to be able to block access to the data needs to be in a state of what we call business complete. So what does that mean? So when an SAP business process is designed through purchase requisition, for example, to purchase order, to receiving the sale, goods receipt notes, to logging the goods into a warehouse, to then physically paying the invoice. That whole process is defined. And there are certain measures along the way that say this is business complete, where you're basically setting data inside your SAP database tables to say, okay, we've now completed that part. The interpretation of that in any SAP implementation can sometimes be ambiguous. In other words, a customer, if there's 5 points along the journey, may go, well, in our business, we only need to do points 1 to 4. Point number 5, we don't care about. We've never done that. But then all of that data is sitting there, and because it hasn't pushed through that point 5, that stage 5, that last final bit, it's not business complete. So it gives us the problem of not being able to block the data. So when we come up against that, you either need to modify or enhance the piece of the ILM technology which is deciding whether it's business complete or not, to understand that you're not using that part of the business process. Or you need to write an automated tool which will just go in and set all those flags for all that data as being business complete. And so there's 2 ways of dealing with it. But this is one of the, I would say, biggest problems we come up with when we're doing ILM GDPR projects, is whether or not the data actually meets the criteria to be blocked.
Okay. And what functionality is available in SAP to address some of these challenges? And are there other solutions and tools that you would recommend businesses have a look at?
Well, a standard within SAP, you've got SAP blocking. So you can block transactional data, access to transactional data within your SAP system. You can block access to master data within your SAP system. You can block access to HR data within your SAP system. And the way that the blocking works is it goes through this algorithm of, is the business process complete for everything to do with that particular entity. So let's say I have a customer inside my SAP system, and the rules are within my organization is that if I haven't done business with that customer for the last 3 years, I should block access to the data, because obviously we're no longer doing business. So for me to block access to the customer master data, which means that I can't go and look at that customer's address, telephone number, all the rest of it anymore, it has to block access to any of the transactional data. So every time we've sold that customer something, there will be records in the sales management process. Every time he's ordered something, there'll be records in the order management process. There could be subsequent records sitting in a separate CRM system. There's all sorts of stuff that's in there. So what it will do for that particular customer is it will go through all of the transactional data. So the blocking system will block access not only to the customer, but the transactional data. So if I went in to try and look at the sales order or the sales invoice for that customer, it would say you can't. Okay. Obviously, for an auditor, that's a little bit of a problem. And there are 2 ways around this. You can either give somebody an auditor's authority or role within the SAP system, which means they're allowed to see block data, or whoever's looking at that block data can make a request, which is then sends a message off to whoever manages your GDPR compliance system saying, I request access to this customer for this particular reason. And it's logged so that you can see who requires access and when they ask for access to it. So that's how the blocking system works. It blocks it by restricting your access to the actual customer or vendor data.
Yeah. And HR is slightly different, but it works on the same sort of principles. So the business complete in an HR sense is when someone has left the organization, that the system considers that to be, sort of business complete. They're no longer working for the organization. And there's a way of just blocking all of the data for that person who's left. And as Mark says, a similar sort of thing, we can give people special access so they can still see these people, or, as default, you wouldn't see that person because they've left. There is also a blocking solution in HR for the data that sits for active employees, and that looks at how old the record is, and it says, according to rules you set up in the system, you should only see records that are valid within a certain period of time. So I might say that I can only see the most recent address record, and if there's another address record there that's 2 years old, I can't see that. So it's a slightly different concept, but it sort of behaves in a very similar way. It's authorization based. It's based on whether something is complete, i.e., have they left or is it old? So it's similar in the way that it operates. It's not moving data out of the system in any way. The data's still there in the database. We're just controlling who can see it through these blocking authorizations. So Mark has mentioned about these problems when data is not completed, and now how that's related to how the business process is run. So SAP have a tool set called Signavio that they include in RISE for S4HANA, for those customers who are going to S4HANA using that mechanism. It is also available without RISE as well. So this Signavio tool set analyzes the way that business processes are being undertaken in an SAP system. So it's installed on the system, it goes and looks at how the process is being run, and it will highlight where a process is not being run in the way that SAP expect, where there's a process breakdown, where there's something that hasn't been completed. It knows what the best practice is and what the SAP are expecting you to do, and it will highlight where there are differences. And it will also highlight where those, incomplete processes are. And not only that, it will give you ideas on how to resolve that problem. So it will tell you what the best practice business process is. It will tell you what you need to change to meet what SAP are expecting. So it's not just telling you about the problem; it's also giving you the solution as well.
Yeah, and of course that also brings us on to the ultimate point of managing your GDPR data, where it's your responsibility to delete or destroy that data out of the SAP system. So SAP provides tools for island destruction, which enables you to destroy data either directly out of database tables, or to be able to destroy data that may have along the way been archived into archiving objects. The other interesting thing on the destruction side of things is that if there's a requirement for legal proceedings on any of that data, then you can actually set a legal hold on it, and the island destruction technology will understand that that's being held for legal purposes and not let you destroy something with a legal hold applied to it. The other interesting tools that you get out of SAP, you've got a tool for masking and for logging. So UI masking is a add-on technology for SAP, which enables you to mask at a user interface display level. So as your SAP GUI or SAP Fiori application is running, if you've got a particular field that you want to stop somebody from seeing based on a security principle, that will actually mask that particular field for that particular person, so that they can't actually see the data. And the other nice thing they provide is a logging solution which logs what everybody is doing inside the SAP system. I know that SAP for a very long time has its change logs, so you can log how data is created, etc. But this is logging absolutely everything that somebody's doing. So somebody's looking at data, trawling through data, looking at data with different applications, etc. That's being logged in the system. And then I think the last thing we can mention here is there is a technology in SAP called Data Protection Workbench. So this enables us to cascade activity out of your core SAP systems into associated other SAP systems in the landscape. So if you've got data which propagates, so for example, you create a customer, it creates an entry in your CRM system. You create a supplier, it creates an entry in your SRM system. You create data and it gets uploaded into your BW system. It will propagate messages out to your other SAP systems, your BW system, etc., to say, okay, this customer has now been blocked or this customer has now been deleted. And that will allow similar action to be taken in the satellite systems.
Yeah, and that point around logging, just coming back to that one, we've worked with customers who the question is particularly in a human resources scenario, how do you know that an individual who's been given access to data isn't, looking at data that they shouldn't look at? Well, the fact is, without the logging switched on, you don't know. There is no way that you can tell whether someone has accessed a data record because they're only looking. So it's not logged in the system without logging switched on. Now, if you do switch logging on, you can then see that an individual has accessed a record just to look at it. And then you can say, okay, well, where is the service ticket that is related to this data access? Why were they accessing it? How can we trace that back to a request? Now, in most organizations, when an employee asks for information, or when there's a promotion or a pay rise or whatever, it'll be related to some sort of request. And that's usually logged in a system somewhere. And you can then trace that log of the access to the data back to a ticket. And if you can't trace it back to a ticket, you know that you need to do some more investigation. So in terms of GDPR, it's a great way of making sure that people are conforming in terms of that. I've accessed this because I needed to access it.
Okay, thank you. What about external solutions?
Well, that's a good question. We've got a solution called Automate, which we've developed at Proceed. And this takes a slightly different approach to managing GDPR data inside your SAP environment. So rather than blocking access to the data, so if you understand, when you block access to the data, that's a functional thing where you can't get access to it, but the data is sitting in the database table still has that data there. So if you've got a bespoke report that looks at that data and doesn't have the blocking technology built into that bespoke report, then you're going to be able to see it. If someone's got access to SE16 in the production environment, they're going to be able to see it. So what this does is at the database table level is it redacts all the GDPR relevant data. So, the addresses, they're redacted, the names redacted, telephone numbers are redacted, salaries, figures, etc. And it's very much customizable in that you can say, well, don't redact that field, but redact this field. So, for example, if we're looking at customer data, I'll redact the address, telephone number, and everything else, but I'll keep the actual physical amounts in there. So if I'm doing a report on how much a particular division has sold over a period of time, I can see that transaction will appear in there. The data is still visible to my report. So we're looking at redacting the data within inside it, and the nice thing about redacting it is that we can unredact it. So let's say, for sake of argument, we need to keep data in the system for the next 20 or 30 years because of the sensitivity of where that employee's worked and what they've done, or because their pensions are being calculated, or for whatever reason, whether it's a compliance issue with the industry or for longevity. We can redact the data, and data sits there quite nicely. And then one day when somebody needs to look at something or write a report or look at that data for a legitimate reason, the data can be unredacted and you can go back and see it. And of course, this is all logged inside an audit log, so that if you ever had somebody visiting from the ICO Commission and say, well, show me how you handle data from somebody that's left the organization, you can go to the reporting module on this, press a button, type in the employee's number, and it will say, okay, well, they left on this date. All of this data was redacted then, and subsequent to that, there's been 2 information requests made, one by the HMRC and one made by the employee itself on these particular dates, where the data was unredacted by this person for that purpose, and then it was re-redacted again afterwards. So it does give you a very sort of like rounded solution to managing your HR data, and of course can be used for sales vendors as well.
And what I like about the solution as well, Mark, is, and we were mentioning earlier about test systems and training systems that may have copies of production data. This Automate tool will help in that circumstance as well, in that quite often if you're running a support environment, you might want to test something out in a production like environment. So you need that production data in another environment that isn't production. Well, Automate will allow you to protect all of that data until you need it. So you can put it effectively beyond use until someone gets the go ahead to run the test or that gets the support ticket in. They get the support ticket that says, yeah, you need, X number of employees, or there's a test needs X number of employees. You bring those employees back for the purpose of the test or the or solving the ticket, and then you redact the data again. And that system is effectively still a copy of production. It's still got all that production data in it, but no one can access it unless they're authorized. And it's, you can leave people, it's an extra layer on top of the SAP authorization concept, which obviously would also block the data. But as soon as someone gets to sort of database level, they could have seen it. Well, Automate will give you that extra layer of protection.
So that's how we redact data using Automate. The other thing we can do is destroy data selectively using Automate. So one of the things you can do is you can press a button and it will destroy an employee after it's been X number of years after the employee's left, if that's your interpretation of GDPR and how you're implementing it within your organization. Some organizations need to keep certain pieces of data, so they'll destroy the bulk of data for an employee, but they may need to keep his training records, for example, in the regulated industry, the example we talked about earlier. In certain industries where the data is used for calculations for the pensions, they may need to keep their salary information and where they worked in there, but destroy the rest of data. So the nice thing about using Automate is you can customize what gets destroyed quite easily out of the system. So it's quite useful for that.
And how long does a compliance project typically take? And does that vary depending on what tools you select to use?
That's a very good question.
Yeah, I mean, I find that quite a lot of the variety in timescales is depending on how prepared the customer is, rather than necessarily the tool set, although the tool set does make a difference. So quite often we found that, when we've gone into a customer and a sort of a discovery period that we thought was going to take a couple of weeks, due to trying to get hold of the right stakeholders, trying to get them into the meetings, try to get decisions made on particularly a retention rule for how long data should be kept, is extremely challenging. What is, again, a really good thing about Automate is that although we do want them to define when the data should be removed entirely, we can still implement the project if they can't make that decision, can't we, Mark?
Yes, that's absolutely true.
So if they can make a decision on when they want to hide it and redact it and what they want to redact, then that's sometimes a lot easier for the business, for the data owners to make that decision, because you're not asking them to get rid of the data and they're never going to see it again. And that tends to be what slows down the decision making. But then in terms of the tool sets, we've definitely found that Automate is a quicker solution when there's a complex requirement. Perhaps if there's only a simple requirement to just purge an employee out of the system after a number of years, that can be relatively quickly implemented. But quite often the requirement's much more complicated than that, and that's when Automate really comes into its own, because, as we say, actually that decision to purge that employee may not be an easy one. May be that they can't actually purge the employee because of the rules that they have. And that's when things with a standard SAP become extremely difficult and time consuming to try and come to some sort of solution, whereas Automate can cope with that complexity much better.
Yeah, in our experience in the delivery team here, delivering solutions, we do both, of course, but delivering it using standard SAP archiving objects, that is a 9 to 12 month project from start to finish. Doing it using Automate, you're looking at 3 to 4 months. So there is it's far more rapid to deploy out there,
and more cost effective, I see.
Yeah, that rapidity definitely, and I would say that, when you're doing a compliance project with SAP standard, you're probably typically looking at 2 or 3 consultants on the project, because you need different skill sets. With Automate, generally can be done with less consultants in a shorter period of time.
Yeah, I mean, typically it starts off with a fit gap analysis of what Automate does out of the box compared to what the customer's needs are. And then based on that, if there's any enhancements required specifically for the customer, then they're made, and then we go for the implementation and testing process and move on to business as usual. if there's no enhancements required, because it's quite feature rich at the moment, then you're looking at 2 to 3 months to actually install and test and put the software live. Over the years, it's brought on a number of additional features as customers have requested additional things. So now Automate, for example, handles unstructured data. So if you've got documents in a content management system which are associated with either an employee or a customer or a vendor, it will destroy those at the point where it's destroying a employee. It will also block access to them if you have the correct type of content management system, i.e. one that's got lifecycle management built into it. It will also stop access to that as well. Handles things like e-forms and all that sort of additional stuff.
Okay, well, let's finish it off there then, because I think we've covered quite a bit. Thank you very much for joining me.
No, thank you for putting it all together.
All right, no problem.
Right, brilliant.
Always a pleasure.
Okay, and thank you very much for listening. We hope you found it informative. And as always, if you want any more information on our services, do visit proceedgroup.com. And if you want to speak to us about some of the technology that we've talked about today and get started with your compliance project, you can reach out to us at info@proceedgroup.com. Thank you very much, and until next time.